come to Art 10, and we're bringing ourselves in a learning curve that is accomplishing something that is rather major. It's accomplishing a recalibration of how we learn and assures us that much of what has been developed consciously in human heritage will be available to us to be understood by us and to be creatively used and employed by us. The title is Frames of Reference, Squares of Attention. And one of the most difficult things is to get over the big picture, which is the entire square, the entire frame, which the mind participates in with all of the natural functions and gives us the frame of reference so that the physical existential world correlates to the mind's objective order. And in between it are the connecting deeds. And so the standard way to talk about the big picture, the frame of reference, the picture of reality which the mind participates in and recognizes is stable, is thought, word, and deed. Thought, symbols, word, myth, and deed, ritual. And that thought, word, and deed in nature are what's real. This is limited. And to insist upon it exclusively is a flaw. And that flaw makes a recursion from expansion, from development, and the recursion always then brings in a tendency for regressions and for reductions. And so as soon as human beings were civilized enough to have very powerful thought, very powerful minds, powerful symbolic structures of form, they felt that that was it, that they had put the cinch or the linchpin on the whole cycle of what was real, and the mind was the arbiter then of the final order of what was real. And whatever the mind then projected out would be the truth. And that the mind would project it out in reference, in correlation with the physical actions of nature. And this then would constitute reality. And this is an error. It is a flaw. The reason it is a flaw is that it doesn't go far enough. In fact, it only goes halfway to reality. And so one insisting on this frame of reference, that that's all that there is someone who is half learned, only half learned. The other half of learning deals with a cycle of consciousness. And consciousness comes into play in vision. And we're using phases now because it helps us to recalibrate everything that happens in terms of processes and everything that registers in terms of forms. And without the phase form structure, which I've developed over 40 years, it's not apparent at all where you are in your coordination of reality. And it also does not give you a kind of binary recalibration of actuality that allows you to go back in and literally digitalize your reality by keeping life and experience and vision and nature and something that we will see in a couple of weeks, history, keeping all of those processes understandable in terms of what they really are doing, but also comparative and contrasting in terms of differences, in terms of not just location where they are on a line of development, but that they have transpositional qualities that are extraordinarily important. The most poignant 20th century proof of this was done by a woman named Barbara McClintock. She's the greatest female scientist of the 20th century. She's American. She lived to be about 90 years old. She won the Nobel Prize in 1983 when she was 81 years old. She spent 70 years tending cornfields to learn the genetics and some of the mysteries in genetics that were startling for decade after decade when she brought them up. And one of the most powerful things that she discovered early on, she was a little munchkin, about 5 feet tall, very cheerful, used to smoke and dance and sing and just have a good time. And then she got it that there's something hauntingly mysterious going on in life on the cellular level, because the carrier of all of the traits that living things have are in the chromosomes. And no one had ever seen a chromosome until she did. She was the first person, because she was meticulous. She was a little patient, unrelenting hunter of peculiar, mysterious truthfulness, and understood that what you're seeing is only a part of what is real, and there is something that you're not seeing that you must not see, and be conscious that you're not seeing it, yet it is there, and that gives the context of openness that allows for the form to be precisely what it is. Now, there's a wonderful poem by Wallace Stevens, and it's interesting because Barbara McClintock was born in Hartford, Connecticut, and so was Wallace Stevens. She was born in 1902, he was born in 1879. And he grew up to be the vice president of the Hartford Accident Insurance Company, one of the biggest insurance companies in the world. But he was also poetic. And when he would take the commuting train into New York from Connecticut, or commute into his Hartford offices, he would always make a poem for the day in his vision. And when he would get to the office, his executive secretary would take down the poem of the day. And he became one of the greatest poets of all time. This is one of his earliest poems. It's called The Snowman. And it's about how to see exactly and precisely by paying attention to the fact that you have a 0 and 1 always operating together. Tau and te are always operating together. And if you keep them as a complementary set, the te will be distinctly 1 and the tau will be distinctly 0. Here's the snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and to have been cold a long time, to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind. that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself beholds, nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. American Zen, pure, precise. Barbara McClintock was the first to find that what she was patiently searching for and looking for, that she found, and they were the chromosomes of corn. Corn has 10 chromosomes, we have 23. And she's the first person to be able to detect the differences in the 10 chromosomes of corn and to arrange them into an order and to be able to see on these chromosomes the genes that are the carriers of the traits. And after about 40 years of doing this patient work, she came up with one of the most startling conclusions imaginable. And for 30 years, no one believed her. People said, well, this can't be. Because she said that the chromosomes were not permanent, that some genes moved around to different chromosomes and to different parts on a chromosome. And derisively, people called them in the 1930s, when she first came out with it, jumping genes. How stupid can you get? Chromosomes are the structure of life. They're the plan of how things are, and things are. And so the chromosomes have to be very stable and be what they are. She said, I have looked at what is there. Clearly, they move. It's like Galileo saying, the stars are not permanently placed. They move. There are moons of Jupiter that move around Jupiter, not around the sun, not around the earth. She said genes in chromosomes move. And she used a great example. She said there are linked genes. There are pairs of genes that like to be linked together. And one of the examples she used is red hair and freckles. That if one of your parents has red hair and freckles, you will get this linked gene of having red hair and freckles. But sometimes you will get red hair and no freckles. Or sometimes you will get freckles and no red hair. It means that the linked genes become unlinked. And the only way that they can become unlinked is that one of them has migrated someplace else on the chromosome or to a different chromosome. And she said this in corn is very interesting. And she used Indian corn. She used what's called Zea maize, M-A-Y-S in science, Latin, but M-A-I-Z-E, the multicolored corn. And she found that she could make the correlations of where the genes on these chromosomes were correlating with the patterns of the color of the kernels of Indian corn. And she learned from this that if you are meticulous, you can track and find out exactly what gene does what, where it is, and when it moves to a different place, you will get a different effect from that gene because it is now in a different choreography. It's the same gene, but in a different context, it will perform a variant of its capacity. And so life is actually a scintillation and not just a plan. And of course, many people said, just like they said to Galileo, that can't be. Life has been made exactly and precisely over billions of years. It is only and just exactly what it is. She said, no, it is constantly shimmering and dazzling in its potential for new forms, new qualities, new things. Our squares of attention are moving the frame of reference so that it shifts its place, and as it does so, transformation comes into play as a dimension of time-space, and it is changed. That visionary consciousness is like a fifth dimension. It's a quintessential dimension. And when you have a five-dimensional continuum, many aspects are now possibly real that could never have been thought to be real before. And it is out of that visionary, conscious, contemplative process of five-dimensional conscious time-space that art emerges. Art is born out of the magic nature of quintessential dimensionality. And when art forms come into their emergence as forms, they are not like natural forms. They're not like ritual forms. They're not like symbolic forms. They displace ritual forms by possibility instead of just steps. Now one has a whole dance. And they come into play by changing the way in which symbols in symbolic form, the way in which the mind is based on the brain, is distinctly integral and has steps of action, steps of formal objectivity, which one can say, if you do such and such and so, this will be the outcome. But when a five-dimensional visionary continuum comes into play, the possibilities of what it might be are as real as the existential fact of what it is in this determination. And so in quantum mechanics, in quantum physics, what is real is a whole range of infinite possibilities of whatever it is that you're looking at, of whatever it is as a process, whatever it is as a form. But that as soon as you observe it as an observer, you quintessentially cinch it into that particular time space, and it is exactly that now here for you. It can change. How can it change? In a tunable, radical way, because it has two different components that work as a binary. One component of it is its tau, the other component is its te. It is a process like a wave, and it is a particle like a form. And so the most fundamental energy qualities in the universe, electrons can be waves or particles. Photons, carriers of light, can be waves or particles. You can work with either possibility and come out with very exact extraordinariness, but if you work with the both together as a set, as a complementary set, you come out with a startling realization that there are worlds beyond number, and that the cosmos is an infinity, not a unity. It's not a universe, it is a cosmic bouquet of all possibilities, all worlds, worlds without end. The ancient way in which this was taught, in which it was carried over into the population of men and women much like ourselves about 2,500 years ago. In China, it was with Lao Tzu. In India, it was with the historic Buddha. In Greco-Egyptian worlds, it was with Pythagoras. In all of these seminal figures, all around 500 BC, it was found that one has to unlearn the habitual tribal base, the ritual base by which the mind was formed, to unhook the mind from the ritual action steps and to allow for experience as the bridge in between them to contain a lot of variation. And that the variation then will be the beginning traction of realizing that many possibilities are a higher order of development of integral variation. This is a very difficult thing to convey. And finally, about 100 BC, there were several areas in the world. We're taking China and India and the Greco-Egyptian, Roman, Mediterranean. We're taking those three areas. By 100 BC, there were a number of rare places where men and women could go to learn how to do this in a remarkably refined, almost we would say today, a professional way. That what you went there to do was specifically to uncouple the mind from its habitual frame of reference onto ritual and its categorization, limitation of experience, and to open experience up to experiment. To open ritual up so that it became art. To open the mind up so that instead of being an ideologue, insisting on a certain doctrine, confident that its understanding of the plan could now be projected out and stamped on everyone, to the development of personal historical developments and possibilities. The most powerful place in the world by the turn of the millennium, 2,000 years ago, was just outside of Alexandria in Egypt. It was the most powerful place in the world where men and women went to unhook their minds from a ritual habituation, to allow for an opening to an artistic spirit of person, because it's that artistic spirit of person that is the first resonance of the cosmic form. And so when one comes to one's spiritual person differentially as a form, you have the first glimpse of what the cosmos as a divine being would be. The place was about 25 miles to the west of Alexandria. And you have to understand that Alexandria was like San Francisco. It was made to be the world's greatest city from the beginning. It was never a village. There was a fishing village in Egypt called Rakotis that was nearby. But Alexandria was laid out to be the world city. And it was on an isthmus of land that had a ridge at the top of it. And on one side is the Mediterranean, and on the other side of this ridge was a huge lake called Mareotis. And it's along Mareotis that all of the great developments of food and agriculture were developed, and Egypt became the breadbasket of the Greek world and later on the Roman world. All along, on both shores of Lake Mareotis, were developed the places where vineyards, some of the best vineyards in the classical world were. They made wine. They made the best wine. Roman poets like Virgil and Horace and the Emperor Augustus all testified. Here is one of the big wine vats on the south shore of Lake Mareotis. Today, it has been encroached on by desert, and it looks like it's just a continuance of the fringes of the Sahara Desert. In classical times, 2,000 years ago, it was like Napa County in California. the site of the best vineyards in the classical Mediterranean world. And here is a wine goblet that has all the grapes and the grapevines and the little figures in it. And one can see a larger version of this, which was found in Antioch, which is today in Syria. And that big Antioch chalice was the original grail. And on the outside of it is exactly this pattern of grapes and grapevines, only instead of having the nice little animals of life in it, it had Jesus and the 12 apostles. I am the true fruit of the vine, he said, because he came from this area in a sense of having lived there and taught there for about 30 years. Not only did they make wine, but some of the finest lands for growing wheat and millet and other grains. And so they made not only the wine, but they made the bread there. And there are huge developments in the place that show the ability to find the old traces of bakeries and the different places where grains were grown and threshed and made. And there are also areas where oil was made as well, olive oil and other oils. And so you had three basic staples that formed a triangle. And in ritual, the bread and the wine have been conserved, but the oil has been left out, whereas the original was three: bread, wine, and oil. It's called the oil of gladness, because it is the way my cup runneth over. Thou anointest my head with oil. It's the bridge between the food and the drink, between the grape and the wheat. The olive branch is the branch of bridging peace. It is in this area that one finds the clearest expression of what theory is. And the book written about 25 AD by Philo of Alexandria is called The Contemplative Life. And in Greek, life is bios. And contemplative, the word is theoretikos. Something that is rhetorical is man's learning of how to speak persuasively, rhetoric. But theoretikos is God's way of speaking truth, not to sway opinion, but to convey truth. And so contemplation, theoria, we get from that, was the visionary ability to come to truth rather than to be convinced by someone on the basis of a rhetorical argument. Barbara McClintock is someone who always shied away from the rhetorical convincing and stayed visionary to be able to see the truth, to be able to put herself into a long-term silence. And she worked for 70 years at this. In the contemplative life, Philo says that this was a very peculiar place because the president, at the time that he was there, the president of this therapeutai community, therapeutai, we get therapia, therapeutics, it meant curing, healing by curing, not just to make the symptoms go away and not just to make you better, but to vanish the cause of the symptoms permanently and not just make you better, but to restore you to eternal life. And he says that the president, at the time he was there, and he says it's unusual because it's not usually just the oldest person there that has the most experience, but in this case is a very young teacher who was the best teacher possible on this contemplative way. And he said, he has no thought of making a display. He has no ambition to get a reputation for clever oratory, but desires to gain a closer insight into some particular matters, and having gained it, not to withhold it selfishly from those who, if not so clear-sighted as he, at least have a similar desire to learn. He lingers over it and spins it out with repetitions, thus permanently imprinting the thoughts in the souls of the hearers, since if the speaker goes on descanting with breathless rapidity, the mind of the hearers is unable to follow his language, loses ground, fails to arrive at apprehension of what is said. His audience listens with ears pricked up and eyes on him, always exactly in the same posture, signifying comprehension and understanding by nods and glances, praise of the speaker, by the cheerful change of expression which steals over their faces. And he says that this teacher would teach in this way so that the play of his magic language words would emerge out into the spirit form of the persons. And that spirit form of the persons could reach back and cooperate then with the integral mind, with the symbolic mind, and pull the symbolic mind into a pair with it. So that what occurred then was something that was better than the good, more unified than the one. And that this was then the beholding of the divine as the spirit core. This, of course, is a first-hand witness to Jesus' teaching before he went to Palestine, before he went back to the Holy Land. And he was there for about 30 years teaching in this way. The historic Buddha taught about how to clear the mind of irrelevancies so that one could open up to transform. And Jesus took the transform and showed that a spirit form of person emerges out of this that is resonant through differential possibility with the reality of eternal life, which the cosmos is an eternal living being. Not a being integrally, but a being that combines the integral and differential together so that when it radiates, when it rotates, the angular momentum of the rotation and the brilliance of the radiation creates the process of nature out of which everything comes. And so there is a very precise way of understanding that it is like an infinity sign that curls around and is not circular. One of the things that Barbara McClintock was assigned at one time was to investigate what happens when high-powered radiation is given to chromosomes, what effect do they have? And they used X-rays. And she found, through her spirit, contemplative, intuitive, poetic, she saw that the chromosomes would take themselves out of this kind of butterfly shape and they would become rings. And she was the first person to find, to be able to see, that X-ray radiation on chromosomes exposed to them change into ring chromosomes. And that's why the mutations are so devastating from high-level radiation. Because the whole cycle of the ecology of the way in which genes and chromosomes give the traits go into a short circuit round robin where they do not have a chance to have living iteration, but they are like interference waves and everything becomes scrambled. And you get monsters. People who have minds of ideologies that are limited have these ring-like structures in their thoughts. And they produce monsters. Goya had a famous engraving one time. The sleep of reason produces monsters. That's where they come from. Let's take a little break. Let's come back to what we were talking about before the break. This is the ruins of one of the most important temples to Osiris in ancient Egypt, and it was located where the Therapeutae community was. Osiris was the god of resurrection, and the place in ancient times was called Tap-Osiris because it's the place in which Isis collected all of the different parts, the 14 parts that Osiris's body had been chopped into by his antagonist. The ancient name for that antagonist was Set, and it was changed in Greco-Roman times to Seth. And Set's image in ancient times was that of a red dog, like a dingo of the Sahara Desert, that was just vicious, not tameable. And so Set wanted to destroy his sibling Osiris and so cut him into 14 parts. But Osiris's confrère, his eternal wife, Isis, life itself, herself, collected all of the pieces of Osiris and brought them back together. And at Tap-Osiris is where he was returned whole into the nether world, and then was able there to regenerate life eternally and to come back. And anyone who goes to the land of the blessed, where they raise food in the nether world, spirit food, spirit wheat, spirit grapes, spirit olives. Osiris is green in the netherworld because he's the restored root of the fertility that complements life, the male fertility complementing female life. And it is at Tap-Osiris Magna that the temple to the resurrected Osiris was, and it's where this Therapeutae community that Jesus taught at for 30 years, associated with all of the, not only the farmlands, but nearby is a 1/4 size lighthouse. The full lighthouse was called Pharos, and it was 40 stories high at the entrance to the harbor of Alexandria, so that there was a huge mirror with a flame, fire, burning in front of it. And being 40 stories high in antiquity, it was one of the wonders of the ancient world, it would shine a beacon of light that could be seen, or its glow could be seen, far enough out into the Mediterranean so that when you were sailing from the farther shore of the Mediterranean, several hundred miles, by the time you got out of sight of that shore, you would be able to just pick up the light of Alexandria beckoning you back home again, back into port. And just by Tap-Osiris Magna was a smaller Pharos lighthouse, because this was one of the great checkpoints in the ancient Greco-Roman world. All of the caravans going east or west, all of the ships going east or west, would pass through Tap-Osiris Magna, where the customs were, where the transition from the further world into the industrial, economic, cultural center that Alexandria was. Alexandria, with about 2 million people at the time. There was only one other city in the whole Western world, Rome, that was anywhere near its size. All of the great villas that raised the food, that made the wine, that had the olive groves, that had the nourishment and sustenance of life, lined the shores of Lake Mareotis, and there were dozens and dozens of places where there were piers that went out into the lake about 300-400 feet long. And so there were huge marinas of all the rich and powerful and famous. It's like San Francisco Bay, about the same size. And it would be where Palo Alto up to San Mateo would be on San Francisco Bay. And it was at the end of that the Therapeutai community was located. And men and women for hundreds of years went there. And it was the central place to learn transform by engendering the theoria of contemplative consciousness so that one could transform not only the world and one's mind, but eventually displace the ritual comportments that life had been based on for its traction before, and to now make them an art. And so life became an art. Not just a rigor of travail, not just a trudge of struggle, but it became an art of beauty, of spiritual, personable quality. And this is the center of it. You can get a hold from Harvard University Press. It's always kept in print, volume 9 of Philo's collected works. And if you'll put that with the Odes of Solomon that we took, that I believe are by Mary Magdalene, and you place those together with the Hermetic treatises about 90 AD from the same place, you will have, in about a 70-year span, the truer insight into Jesus than you get in any other place other than 2 documents in the New Testament, the Gospel according to John, who was raised by Mary Magdalene, and the Epistle to the Hebrews by Apollos of Alexandria, who inherited the Jewish-Christian or Christian-Jewish community in Alexandria from Philo. Philo was the head of the community for many, many years, and was present at the crucifixion, identified in the New Testament as certain figures from Alexandria. He was one of those. The quality that's interesting is that one finds the enormous energy and industry. Here's one of the largest kilns in the ancient world that was very near the Therapeutai community. It could fire several hundreds of amphora to carry the wine at a time. And there were indications from some of the records found that more than 200 or 300 ships every month were carrying wine all over the known world. Some of the Alexandria wine amphora have been found in the harbor of Marseille, France, in the harbors of places as far afield as India. And so one realizes that this was a center of international commerce and deep wisdom, and of course one of the great figures was a Roman soldier who was killed. His name was Minos. And when he was killed, because of his visionary capacities, his body was transported about 20 miles south of the community, and he is called Saint Minos, in Arabic Abu Minos, and there's a monastery there. And this is Saint Minos in the ancient Paleolithic Aran's position praying, and next to him are 2 camels, a pair of camels kneeling together. And if you will look at the original Tibetan iconography of their Dharma chakra, you will find the Dharma chakra in between two kneeling camels, because not only is the Mahayana a Jesus-influenced Buddhism, but the Vajrayana is a distillation of it as well. There are many things that one can learn and one can realize. And what we're trying to do is to keep in focus that visionary consciousness is where the contemplation is, not in the mind. It's not a symbol thought phase, but it is a vision process phase, which means that the vision process has a complementation. It is able to weave, not weave as forms weave, but to interpenetrate, because in processes what you have are waves, not particles. And when you get an interpenetration of waves, you get a density front that allows for forms to emerge. When a star goes supernova and it sends out its burst of energy into interstellar dust clouds of hydrogen, the density waves that are made by the shock waves of the explosion coming through take the energy of the waves from the supernova that are carrying subatomic parts of not just hydrogen, but subatomic parts of all kinds of different elements that have been made in that star before it went supernova. And those waves coming into the interstellar gas cloud are what then produce the stable elements that we know of. All stars make elements up to iron, but they don't make anything higher than the element iron. It takes the concussion of a supernova to make elements that are heavier, that are more complex than iron, all the way up to uranium. And so all of the higher elements are made out of supernovae density waves imploding on the natural hydrogen gas clouds all throughout the cosmos. This is how matter is made in this way. Art is made this way. Spirit forms are made this way. Persons are made this way. Persons are not individuals in the mind. They're not the character of the stories. They are not the ritual figure of the karmic actions. They are several orders expanded from that, and it means then that one has to learn to use the frame of reference as a frame of reference, but that it can be moved, and when it does, it is no longer a frame of reference, but what I call a square of attention. It operates as if it were a frame, but it is a movable feast. And because it is able to maintain its stability throughout these permutations, there then develop proportions of different frames of reference now become squares of attention, and it's in those ratios that rationality is made. Rationality is not a quality of the mind's structure. Integral is a quality of the mind's structure, but proportionate resonances in sets making harmonic ratios is a quality of differential consciousness able to make spiritual prismatic forms who now are able to make the spectrum of all the possibilities. And we'll see that history is a higher vibration of vision. Without history, the cosmos could not be, because it is out of the historical, energetic dynamic, out of the kinesis of spirit-person-based process phase that science is able to come. And so science, like art, is concerned with differential forms. And where art comes out of vision by the artist, science will come out of history by the historical scientist, but the scientist working in a historical process. And when vision and history work together, and art and science work together, they make a square of attention that is completely outside of the mind's original frame of reference. This is one of the most difficult things to do. Our planet has never mastered history, except by rare individuals and very small oases of communities of people, always very iffy and exposed to regression, exposed to doubt, just as in our time. Science is very precarious right now all over the world. What comes into play is a regressive metaphysics that the mind in its original frame of reference can feed back to the rituals, re-stuff back into the myths. And so what happens is that human spirit persons are not prismatically made into lenses, and vision is sucked back into a mental structure where it is then put into convenient little doctrines and convenient little plans. And what you get out of that, because the energy is so enormous now, is an enormous energy of regression. The book of Revelation in the New Testament, the Apocalypse, is all about 2,000 years ago towards the end of the 1st century AD, of an enormous regression that had set in, and that vision was literally perishing. And instead of the hermetic art of spiritual transform, you began to get a regressive Gnostic mythology of making a metaphysics out of everything, and of it being reduced back down to where it can be conveniently handled by manipulation and control and authority. When you have art as a phase, and you have vision as a phase, that angle that they make complements perfectly the angle that myth and symbol make together. So that your square of attention, when you have myth, symbol, vision, and art, is perfectly balanced. It's equipoise between the integral and the differential. And the angle that is between symbol and vision becomes the most important angle in reality. It is where the angle of the exchange of centers between symbols, the symbolic mind, and the visionary conscious process happen. When you have two vectors that have an angle between them, the point in the middle between the two vectors at a given distance, at a given time, at a given momentum, that point will create a pair of pairs. It is a pair of the resultant in between the two vectors, but is also a median in between the distance between the two vectors, so that the center will be a pair of pairs of dynamics, and it's out of that structure that is called in mathematics a tensor. As tensors that Einstein used to make the theory of relativity. It's a very powerful mathematical form. It was unknown 2,000 years ago. It was not able to be envisioned 2,000 years ago. And one of the difficulties is that 2,000 years ago, as far as mathematical vision could go, was only to the beginnings of trigonometry. And trigonometry, as a mathematical science 2,000 years ago, was certainly a development of geometry off the plane into the sphere. But the difficulty is that spheres cross-sections of them will always be circles, will be circular. And so the world was not ready to understand the high mathematics of elliptical forms and elliptical kinesis, which is what atoms are based on, star systems, is not upon circles, but it's upon interpenetrating elliptical kinesis. The first mathematician to understand that was Johannes Kepler, because his mentor had seen only the second supernova ever that happened in human recorded history. The first supernova was recorded in China, not in Europe, 1054 AD, and the explosion of that supernova is now the Crab Nebula. But the second supernova in recorded human history was seen all over Europe, in India, in China, in 1572, and the man who saw it was Tycho Brahe, who was in a kind of a utopian island called Uraniborg, patiently observing all of the planets and all of the stars from his observatory. And because it was such a complicated math, he had to find somebody who could visionarily do a new math to work with his observations of his supernova. And he found the young genius Johannes Kepler. And when Kepler was brought and was able to see and work out a new math for interplanetary stellar dynamics, he was rewarded because the third supernova available in recorded history happened in 1604, and he was there with all the math in place to see it for the first time, and he wrote a huge, magnificent volume. That's the most important book in between Newton and Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos of 200 AD. The book was called The New Astronomy. It's the basis of what became astrophysics. We were blessed in 1987 because the fourth recorded supernova in human history took place. It's called 1987A, and we were able to confirm and develop many things from this and understand, yes, we know now this is how this works, and it works in a very high visionary way. It does not work of mental symbols referentially identifying and linking with ritual, karmic, existential acts, no matter how specific they are. They're important there, but they need to be transformed to go further, to go into an expansion. And one of the most beautiful, simple ways of expressing this for all time was made by the great photographer Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams, a consummate photographic, artistic genius, wrote a series of 3 books, one called The Camera, and the third called The Print, but the middle one, the second volume, is called The Negative. And however you are able to master your camera, and however you're able to develop your print, you must understand how to have a conscious, movable calibration for your negative. Otherwise, you won't have the art. You will just have the ritual recording of the camera just mechanically, automatically recording what's there. But whereas if you use the zone system, a series of 8 shades between black and white, 8 that the first is black, the 8th is white, but in between are shades of gray. So this is the gray scale. And at the center of the gray scale of the 8 is the 5th. And it's the 5th zone that's the quintessential. It's like the vision. It's like our 8 phases, or like the 8 zones of Ansel Adams' art of photography. And if you calibrate your whole range of the 8 using the 5th, it's about 18% gray on the gray card. If you calibrate the entire sequence, the entire spectrum with that, you will be able to do something that is amazing. You'll be able to shift the entire spectrum in an expansion or a contraction. Not just one phase, but the entire scale of all 8 will be able to be shifted to an expansion or to a contraction. And one has to understand that in doing this, there's an art. Because it doesn't just go into a ritual correlation. It doesn't just go into a mental correlation, but the expansion creates further zones that were not there before, further refinements, and one can go all the way out to 10. And when you have an expansion from an 8 to a 10 scale, the ability to work artistically with the negative shifts to a very, very interesting, refined level. Because at that level, one exceeds, because one could go further than 10 zones, one exceeds the capacity of photographic emulsions physically to record the refinement that you are capable of visionarily. And so photographic film changed at that point from photography on negatives that were emulsions, usually is silver nitrate or platinum, to a new form of photography called CCDs, charged coupling devices. And CCDs work by infinitely calibratable pixels that one can scientifically have to any range, any calibration that one would have. One doesn't have just 10 zones. One has an infinity of refinement available by CCDs. We have CCDs now available commercially. Santa Barbara Instrument Systems makes the best in the world. They're sensitive to get 1 photon of light and only record that by itself, or 1 electron by itself. We have a capacity in the 21st century to carry our art of refinement to any expansion that one would like to carry it to. The difficulty is we have a population of human beings who do not know how to learn how to learn. And so that's why this education has been made. Sometimes, like Moses, it takes 40 years. And it has to be made not through planning, but through the actual give and take of teaching how this is done over several generations, over many decades, in order to get the sensitivity and the art of it and the science of it, the refinability of it, so that it can be conveyed. And once conveyed, it produces a condition that one of Wallace Stevens' poems, Asides on the Oboe, is a poem about. He wrote this at the end of the Second World War, one of the great poetic geniuses of all time. He wrote, "The prologues are over. It is a question now of final belief. So say that final belief must be in a fiction. It is time to choose." And then later on, I'll skip over a small section, which concludes, "In the end, however naked, tall, there is still the man who has had the time to think enough. The central man, the human globe, responsive as a mirror with a voice, the man of glass, who in 1,000,000 diamonds sums us up. He is the transparence of the place in which he is, and in his poems we find peace. He sets this peddler's pie and cries in summer. The glass man, cold and numbered, dewily cries, "Thou art not august unless I make thee so." Clandestine steps upon imagined stairs climb through the night because his cuckoos call. And then it goes on from there. We're taking Henry Moore and Chi Pai Shi as two of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Chi Pai Shi lived into his mid-90s, and he died in 1957, just a couple of weeks before Sputnik, but you can see from his official portrait here at 94 that he was an extraordinary, sage-like artist figure, recognizable anytime in the last 5,000 years in Chinese history. One can see this is who he is. But one of the things that comes out, and this is an original Chi Pai Shi, his simplicity. And one needs to read the meaning in between the mythic experience and the symbol so that one gets the meaning vector, but then one has to use one's vision and one's artistic prismatic form to get something beyond meaning. That's called the creativity. And so the vectors are meaning and creativity, and the tensor is the relationality of the whole of this. One sees the firecrackers and realizes this is Chinese New Year. This is the Lunar New Year. And pink lanterns, because this is involving the whole of life, including children. And the firecrackers have a big classical pot of tea. This pot is a special kind of Chinese clay that is classically made, and teapots made of this clay always have the shape. They're usually somewhat smaller. This one is for an entire family, but there are only 2 cups here. It's made for a pair who are the pair that are the tuning fork for an entire community, for an entire family expanded to an entire community. It's for a pair who together are like the tuning fork of the founders of the nourishment for the entire scale of humanity. And here is the peony. And of course, the peony that comes out in Chinese Lunar New Year is the first flower that occurs. If you've ever been in a severe winter climate where peonies are grown, you realize that the first thing that comes through the frozen earth that is still there is the green spike finger of the beginning of the peony plant. In Calgary, Alberta, where I first learned to see it, the ground is still frozen. You couldn't dig it with a pick even, but the peony plant is so profoundly powerful, it sends its green finger through the frozen earth, and that becomes the peony plant. And when the peony blossoms so that it can open up in its red or its various colors, one realizes that the season has permanently changed. And this is the beginning of not just a new year, but of a new cycle of life. So here it is. The script is both the grass script of his artistic personality and the ancient bronze engraving script back at the origins of Chinese civilization some thousands of years before. One of Chi Pai Shi's greatest capacities was to take something that was so basic that even peasants could understand it. So here in 1948, at a time when China had suffered since 1909 until 1949, travail after travail, the Chinese Revolution of Sun Yat-sen, the great revolutions in between them and the Japanese taking over China in the 1930s, all of the Second World War, and then the war between the nationalists and the Chinese People's Communist Party for years and years. And towards the end of this, in 1948, Chi Pai Shi made a painting of a simple ear of maize, saying, "This year is a bumper crop." It's interesting because symbolically we started with our 21st century corn mother, Barbara McClintock, who tended maize for 70 years and understood that it's not just that DNA occurs in double helixes that contain within them the 23 sets of chromosomes that contain all the genes that determine how all the proteins are going to fold and how all the enzymes are going to membrane processes together. But she's the one who discovered that they move around, that it is a movable feast, that life is not on some permanent, occult plan that God will never change his mind, but that is a universe that has infinite freedom, is expandable to any scale. We can move not only frames of reference, we can move the entire spectrum of integral around and play with it, which gives us capacities that are unknown to tribal or to metaphysical groups. They do not understand this. It is as far beyond them as trigonometry would be, and as far beyond trigonometry as quantum physics or relativity is. We are many scales of order, having moved whole spectrums of squares of attention, the entire harmonic sets of it, many times. It's just that there are so few people who understand this. And it's not an understanding of the mind alone. Equal to the understanding of the mind is the appreciation of the person. It's the appreciation of the person that comes into formal handshake. When the meaning becomes clear as an idea, it also is an arranged order in the imagination of feeling-toned images. And when the artistic person is able to prism that imagination and that source of ideas in the mind, prism it in such a way that vision and experience now flow into an interpenetrating wave-front density, complexity, what comes out of this is more magical than just the magical world of Aladdin's lamp. Henry Moore wrote, he said, "My liking for holes in sculpture came about from just wanting to make space itself three-dimensional. For me, the hole is not just a round hole, it is a penetration through." And he realized that when you make a penetration through the symbolic form, it now has the ability to breathe vision in its artistic form, all of itself, and becomes easier then for a person who has penetrated through their own mental forms with vision to breathe with it and to then get a new kind of a yoga, not the yoga of breath control by a ritual posture or a mental structure, but a new kind of a yoga that is a kaleidoscopic one. And it is the kaleidoscopic yoga that is being taught here. It so far outdistances anything else. There's several hundred years ahead already. Take your time. Find some of the material on Henry Moore and realize with me about Chipai Shia. We'll bring some more of his work next week. It seems peculiar at first to compare this wonderful 21st century type of a world to, say, a pinnacle of the classical past. This was done in 1952 when a lot of Henry Moore's sculptures were taken to Florence, Italy. And they were put on a roof overlooking the city of Florence, and it was amazing to everyone, including Moore, that his sculptures lit up the Renaissance classical preserved beauty of Florence, Italy. They were not disjunctive at all, because their particular harmonic was just a scale that was expanded of a scale that was already there and brought out new aspects that one could hardly have supposed. When Moore began to really do work after that, here's a thing called Moonhead. It is a complementation, a complementarity of two faces. Each one would be abstract in themselves, but when they are brought together, the ratioed proportionate resonance is of a new possibility of face. One of Wallace Stevens' poems ended with the lines, "They now say the good man has no face, as if they knew." More next week.